Hello and welcome. I'm going to be trying out a different format in this video. Namely, I do not have any script in front of me, and so what I say is going to be more off the top of my head. My intention is to be able to release videos a little bit more frequently, and my hope is that I'll still have some things to say which you might find helpful or at least interesting. The first topic that I want to cover in this new format is personal identity. Now, first of all, I want to be clear about what I mean when I say identity, because this is a term which I think gets used in a couple of different contexts to mean slightly different things. Sometimes people use the word identity to mean an object or agent's physical structure. So basically the sum total of all of the physical facts about that object. Now, we as humans have pretty good mechanisms for trying to answer questions about this type of identity. If you want to understand the physical structure of some sort of object or entity, then you can use all the tools available in science. So for example, if you want to understand the identity of a human in this sense, you could use sociology to understand the way that that human interacts with their society. You could use biology in order to better understand the structure of that human body and the way it functions. You could use chemistry to better understand the underlying chemical mechanisms involved in that human body's functioning. You could use things like psychology and neuroscience in order to better understand what's happening inside that person's brain. Now, for most practical purposes, these fields alone would give you a pretty good idea of what that person is, physically. But there's also a deeper level that can be explored. Because humans are a part of the physical universe, we are subject to the laws of physics. And while there are still certainly things that physicists don't know about how reality works at the most fundamental level, my understanding is that the sorts of processes underlying the functioning of a human being are very well understood even at that fundamental level. In particular, the standard model of particle physics will do just fine in the circumstances typical for a human being's existence. And when you consider the human being on that most fundamental level, you find that there is no clearly defined boundary between the human and the environment in which they exist. Now, you can define such a boundary, certainly, but the boundary is not itself a fundamental feature of reality. It's something that we impose on reality in order to help make sense of it. Should the human being's hair be considered a part of the human or a part of the environment? What about the bacteria in their gut? What about bacteria in the mouth or in the surface of the skin? If a person has some sort of implant, should that implant be considered a part of the human, or is it something else? These are questions which could not possibly have objectively correct answers. You could know everything that there is to know about the physical universe, and it still wouldn't tell you where to draw the boundary between a human and their environment. In a similar way, there is no sharp dividing line between what biological organisms count as human and what biological organisms count as non-human. This is a fairly unavoidable consequence of the theory of evolution. And even if we're considering one specific person as opposed to human beings in general, science does not give us any sharp dividing lines between what counts as that person and what would count as not being that person anymore. We understand that over time, people inevitably change. But how much can a person change while still continuing to be that same person? Also, does the process by which that change happens matter, or is it just the starting state and the final state that we need to compare to determine whether it's the same person? Engaging with thought experiments can be an excellent way of exploring one's feelings on these topics. Would you be willing to go inside a Star Trek-style transporter that breaks down your original body and reconstructs a new one for you at a different location? If you were somehow able to undergo a process of self-replication where you divide into two identical copies of yourself, then is there any sense in which one of them is you more than the other? Or are neither of them you? Would you still be you if some or all of your memories were replaced with different ones? What about if your personality was changed, or your beliefs? Once again, you could have a godlike knowledge of the physical facts about the universe and still not have an answer to these questions. And in my view, it's not because the questions are somehow deeply mysterious, but rather because they are questions without objective answers. Note that that is not the same thing as them not having answers at all. It just means that the answers that you give are going to be somehow dependent on value judgments. The universe fundamentally does not care the way humans divide it up into labels and categories. Humans and any other thinking creatures, however, do have the capacity to care about those labels and categories, because they affect the way that we perceive the world, they affect the way that we live and the way that we think. So these questions about what counts as a human being, about what the boundaries of the human are, about how the human can change while still maintaining their identity over time, these are questions which we can only answer relative to a particular goal. That goal might be allowing us as humans to make better sense of the world around us. We might want to consider whether adopting a particular view of human identity might predispose us toward certain other intuitions or moral beliefs. It is for precisely this reason that identity beliefs come to be discussed and debated in politics. And in the context of politics, identity beliefs are often framed as though they could be true or false, as opposed to simply useful or not useful for attaining a certain end. If you watch for this confusion in practice, you'll find it all over the place across a huge number of different issues, and you'll also find that in each case where it is applied, it leads to people talking past one another. So when people are arguing about things like when a human life begins, or what counts as a man or a woman, or the extent to which a person's adopted family is their real family, these are not questions which can ever be settled by reference to physical facts about the world, even in principle. Now, this does not mean that any view is equally as good as any other on these issues. Of course not. We can judge different answers to these questions using the same sorts of mechanisms that we use to evaluate any other moral judgments. A consequentialist would evaluate the consequences of adopting a particular view of human identity, and would adopt whichever one produces the best consequences by their own standard. A person with a different set of moral beliefs might end up disagreeing with those value judgments, even if they agree about all of the physical facts about the world. But with that said, a lot of the disagreement that I see occurring between people with different identity beliefs are not actually the result of fundamentally different moral values, but rather the result of misunderstandings of physical facts. And I would argue that this is true for value claims in general, not just claims about identity. For example, someone who believes in a practice like human sacrifice most likely believes that performing that sort of sacrifice will have a material consequence in the physical world, which it simply will not have. And so even though the claim itself that human sacrifice is a good thing is a value judgment, which is not intrinsically true or false, it is in almost all cases going to be dependent on a belief about the consequences of that action, namely that there exists some sort of God that will be sated by that sacrifice. Now, of course, there are some people that are genuinely not consequentialists, and so they might think that doing this sacrifice is good intrinsically and not because of any consequence. But my suspicion is that those people are going to be in the minority. Most people doing a sacrifice want to get something out of it, either in this life or in some sort of afterlife. And in a similar way, a lot of the people who say that human life starts at conception and then use that judgment in order to argue that abortion is a form of murder, are basing that claim about human identity, at least in part, on beliefs about the physical world which are not true. For example, many of them believe in a human soul which enters the physical world at a particular point in time and makes the human what they are. And that is not just a value judgment. As soon as that soul has any impact whatsoever on the physical world, it is no longer in the realm of a value judgment. It is making a claim about physics. And the only way we could possibly know about human souls would be if they were interacting with our brains. If souls were just floating above our heads, kind of an ethereal plane that doesn't have any interaction with ours, then how would we even know about them? Why would we be talking about them? So to summarize, one way of looking at identity is by considering the physical structure of an object or entity. And one of the things that we learn as we study the physical structure of the universe is that nature itself doesn't care about the labels that we use to break up the world into smaller pieces. It is completely agnostic on what a human is, just as it is completely agnostic about the boundary between the color red and the color orange. What fundamentally exists, as far as we can tell, is the universe as a whole, obeying the laws of physics, and we humans are the ones who break it up into smaller pieces in order to better understand it. As a consequence, claims about human identity have a component which is purely evaluative as opposed to objective. In other words, claims about human identity depend on one set of values. Just like with any other set of value judgments, claims about human identity can nonetheless be based upon claims about objective reality, which could be true or false. The physical structure of nature does not uniquely determine a view of human identity, but theories of human identity necessarily make reference to facts about the physical world, in addition to value judgments about those facts. Now I want to move on to a different context in which the word identity is used, which is related but distinct. If identity is just an object's physical nature, then all objects have an identity because all objects that we are aware of are physical. So a rock has an identity, which is simply the physical nature of that rock. But there are some entities in the physical world, namely things like humans and other animals, which, in addition to having their own physical nature, also have an internal representation of their own physical nature. This is a sense in which a human has an identity while a rock does not. The rock doesn't have any internal representation of its rockness, it simply is a rock, whereas a human is a physical structure, but at the same time it has an internal representation of its own physical structure. This is a concept that I will refer to as personal identity. It is the representation of an entity which it contains within itself. Now, as we've already seen, there is not any objectively correct definition of what that entity is. Deciding on the boundaries of that entity, both physically and conceptually, requires a value judgment. Let's consider first the physical boundaries of that entity. So far, it might seem like the examples I've given in this context are not very important. Things like whether hair is included as part of the body or whether an implant is included as part of a body. If you believe in notions of bodily autonomy, then these would have some consequences, but I can imagine someone dismissing them away as edge cases, not being representative of a deep ambiguity about the nature of identity. So let's take a more dramatic example. Consider an ant which exists as part of an ant colony. Now, I don't know very much about the biology or neuroscience of ants, and so please take what I'm about to say more as a thought experiment than a specific claim about how ants represent themselves. Consider the following two possibilities. First, the ant could represent itself as being fully limited to its own one singular body. Second, the ant could represent itself as being a part of the larger ant colony. That is, not a whole agent in and of itself at all, but rather only a part of a larger agent. I used ants in this example because they actually exist, but one could just as easily think about the Borg in Star Trek or any other sort of hive mind where the individuals are simply parts of a larger collective. My question is as follows. Is one of these views somehow more accurate than the other? There's clearly a big difference between those two views. In one of them, the ant identifies as the specific singular ant, and in the other, the ant identifies itself as a part of the larger ant colony. Now, of course, these two perspectives are not mutually exclusive. The ant could see itself as, on the one hand, an individual, and simultaneously, on the other hand, a part of a collective made up of other such individuals. But when it comes time for that ant to act within the world, its actions could be reflective of either its interest as an individual ant or its interest as a part of a collective, and those interests could be called into conflict. So then, what sorts of actions count as acting in the ant's self-interest? Well, that would rather depend on the boundaries of the sense of self of that ant, and there is no objective fact to the matter about where those boundaries ought to be drawn. Determining what counts as being in an entity's self-interest depends on value judgments, not just about what would count as a good or bad outcome for that individual, but also about where the boundaries of the self are. And this is true not just for relatively simple organisms like ants being organized into larger superorganisms, but also for creatures that are more complicated, like humans. There are plenty of ways that humans can identify with structures that are larger than themselves, and in doing so, they are in some sense extending the boundaries of their selfhood beyond their skin and out into the world to encompass other organisms as well. This is one of the psychological bases of collectivism. And if you live in a highly individualistic society, you might be biased against these sorts of views of selfhood. you might be tempted to think that there's something intrinsically less rational about them. It might immediately conjure to mind situations where the individual's rights or freedoms are being restricted for the greater good of the collective. And I think that is a fair concern to have about a view of selfhood which is highly collective. And yet one must also acknowledge that there are genuine drawbacks to having a highly individualistic view of self as well. A society which has committed to an individualist view of selfhood to the exclusion of any collectivist tendencies can become blind to the ways that individual actions can negatively affect the collective upon which they depend. My intention here is not to argue for an exclusively collectivist nor an exclusively individualist model of selfhood, but rather to point out that both of these models have potential advantages and disadvantages. This leads to the central thesis that I had in mind for this video, which is that we ought to adopt a pragmatic view of human identity. When an organism develops an internal representation of itself, that representation ought to be judged on the basis of how useful it is. And that utility can only be determined by reference to a set of moral values. Now, some people might hear this and think that I mean that I don't care about whether an identity claim is true or not. And that's not the case at all. I want to make sure that whenever I have a particular view about human identity, that it is not in any way based upon beliefs about the physical world which are false. This is because one of the fundamental values that I hold is a preference for the truth over falsehood. Even if someone managed to convince me that my life would be better if I believed in a God, I still wouldn't do so because I value having beliefs that are actually true, which is to say consistent with the nature of physical reality. And I have no evidence whatsoever that such a God interacts with the physical world in any way. With that said, one must be very careful when evaluating identity claims. What at first might seem like a claim about physical reality might actually end up being a claim about the boundaries which we draw around conventional objects, which, as we've already seen, do not in fact have objectively correct or incorrect answers. When trying to make these sorts of determinations, it can be helpful to ask the following question. If you were to know everything that there is to know about the structure of the physical universe, would that knowledge allow you to conclusively confirm or reject the identity claim in question? So this perspective does place real constraints on identity claims. Again, I'm not claiming that all views of human identity are equally valid. However, taking a pragmatic view of identity does provide a lot of freedom with how we identify ourselves. We're free to view ourselves not just as singular, isolated individuals, but as parts of larger collectives, however we please. As social creatures, we tend to do this whether we're conscious of it or not. But this view also gives us the flexibility to experiment with different internal representations of ourselves. It allows us to view our own minds as a sort of laboratory in which to experiment with different ways of being. From an individualistic perspective, you are welcome to challenge the utility of the sorts of social labels applied to you by the society in which you exist. The way that you perceive yourself on the inside does not necessarily have to match with the way that other people perceive you. You also are under no obligation to maintain a consistent sense of identity over time. If there are aspects of your inner representation of yourself which are not serving positive functions in your life, then you don't need to hold on to them. You might find that it's most useful to view yourself as a unified singular individual, or you could view yourself as a collection of interrelated parts, or you could even model your mind as consisting of distinct agents with identities of their own. You don't need to make any specific strong claims about the physical world in order to adopt these different positions of selfhood, and indeed different ones might be more useful in different contexts. Simultaneously, thinking from a collectivist perspective, you can focus on the way in which you exist as a part of larger wholes. This could include just the people who are closest to you. As a personal example, and I know this is a common one for many people, my relationship with my wife is an integral part of my sense of self. She tends to remember things better than I do, and so I feel like some of my memories are stored externally through her. I also very much see my self-interest as being bound up with her self-interest. When she's in pain, through empathy, I feel that pain as well. I would suspect that many people who have these sorts of close, loving relationships will have experienced something similar. And so you know what I mean when I say that certain experiences of love can expand the boundaries of the self. Adopting a more expansive view of the self can also help us to feel less isolated and less small. Expanding one's sense of self beyond the limits of one's skin is an exercise in empathy, And though it might be the easiest to do with people who are physically close to us and who we love, it's also possible to do this with people who are distant. One of the most profound revelations of science is that the distinctions and boundaries which seem so natural to us, those between one self and another, or between the subject and the environment, between one species and another, are not fundamental features of reality. Those boundaries are enforced and maintained by us for practical reasons. And so if they aren't serving our purposes, we have the power to change them, simply by changing the way we view ourselves and the world around us. Thanks for watching, and let me know if you like this different format, because it certainly took me a lot less time to create.